from Cornell's College of Art, Architecture, and Planning and the Ashley School of Global Development and the Environment. Today, we're going to talk about the digital divide in America and how to overcome the lack of access to broadband services in rural communities and urban communities across the country. Many people in the US exist on the other side of the digital divide, and this means that folks are excluded from the regular aspects of daily life. Federal policy and state policy has helped to address this, but it hasn't gone far enough. And during the pandemic, we realized that the digital divide was actually a very serious problem in the US. And so communities stepped up to address the problem. Today, our webinar will have three parts. We'll focus first on what is the digital divide and why does it exist? And then we'll move on to where are we at with federal and state policy? What's the history and how has it changed? And then in the third part of the webinar, we will talk about local responses and how communities are stepping up and using innovative planning approaches to address the problem. This talk builds on a book that we recently published called Bridging the Digital Divide in the US. And if you point your camera to that QR code, you can actually download the book for free because we used some of our grant money from the US Department of Agriculture to help make the book open access for everyone. And in it is background on why the digital divide exists, nature of federal and state policy, and a number of case studies from communities across the country, some of which we will be profiling today. We've assembled an excellent panel of speakers for you all today. We're really very pleased to have with us Natasha Bravo, who is my co-author on the book. Also, there's Duxie Shen, but she's not here today. There were three of us. Natasha just recently got her PhD from Cornell University, and she is an expert on infrastructure policy, particularly as regards broadband. When we move to the discussion of policy, we're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Johannes Barr, who's Professor of Media and Information Services and the Director of the James H. and Mary B. Quello Center at Michigan State University. And what I think will be especially helpful, in addition to his very long experience in looking at infrastructure policy, is that Dr. Barr has spent about 18 months as the chief economist in the Office of Economics and Analytics at the U.S. Federal Communications Commission. So he'll give us a perspective from that as well. Next, and joining us is Dr. Colby Humphrey, who's an officer with Pew's Broadband Access Initiative. Pew has really been investing in looking at state policy, local innovation, and in fact, full disclosure, they helped fund the research that Natasha and I have done on this project. And so Colby will be joining us in that second part. And then finally, we have Dan Lamb, who's joining us in his capacity as the deputy town supervisor of the town of Dryden, which took an initiative to do municipal broadband. He is also my colleague here at Cornell in the Cornell Brooks School of Public Policy. So very glad to have you here, Dan, as well. Now, viewers, we want this to be an interactive session. And so we are inviting you to post your questions to the chat, and we will be happy to engage those questions during the seminar itself. We don't need to hold all the questions to the end. So if you have a question as we're going along, pop it in the chat, and I will be happy to bring it up to our speakers. As always, on these Cornell e-keynotes, today's live stream is being recorded and will be available to view shortly after the show is over. If you'd like, you can look at eCornell keynotes on YouTube or LinkedIn Live or Facebook Live, and we'll share the links to those channels in the chat as well. But for now, I want to move to the first part of our webinar today, which is why did we write this book and what is the digital divide? So if you look at that slide that I showed you that was used to advertise the beginning of the presentation, it's slide number 2 in our set, you'll see an older man and 2 young children sitting in the snow on a park bench outside a public building with their computers. Like, what is that about? That, my friends, is what the digital divide looks like. It's rural people It's older adults, it's lower income people, it's people in places where they either don't have access or can't afford access to the internet. So what happens is public libraries, public buildings, often grocery stores, will have their internet bleed out into the parking lot precisely so that users can access internet even when the building is closed. And many of us saw this, children sitting outside fast food restaurants during COVID doing their homework. The digital divide, we estimate between 24 and 42 million Americans are caught on the other side of the digital divide. And for a lot of people who have access to internet, they just can't imagine what it would be like to live in a home that doesn't. And many of us don't understand that this is actually a problem, and it's a problem for a good number of people. And there's three aspects to the digital divide. We're going to focus today primarily on the issue of access. Have we built out the infrastructure that makes it possible for people to connect? This could be the quality, the primary quality infrastructure would, of course, be fiber, but many people rely on cable or DSL if you're close enough, though I think that's too slow now these days. And some people rely on satellite and even their cell phones. But access is not the only problem. The other aspects of the digital divide are problems with affordability. And there was a program during the Biden administration, the Affordable Connectivity Program, to help address issues of affordability, but the funding for that has now gone away. And the final one is adoption. People actually having the device and being trained in how to use it so that they know how to access the internet. So now that I've told you a little bit about what is the digital divide, problems with access, affordability, and adoption, we want to now turn our attention to why does the digital divide persist? And especially why does it persist here in America? And with that, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Natassia Bravo.
Thank you, Mildred. So what is driving the divide? There are several interconnected factors. First, we have a lack of competition. As with other types of fixed infrastructure, there are high costs of entry for broadband providers. It is more effective and more profitable to deliver service in urban, large, high-density populations, which is why these areas are often very competitive. You have a broad choice of provider options. The private sector has understandably prioritized these areas over the rural, low-density areas, which is why perhaps the most familiar dimension of the divide is the urban-rural gap. You also have the nature of the US broadband market. Large national providers already have an advantage because they own much of the country's legacy telecom infrastructure. Providers that were once providing you with phone service are today providing you with internet service. Over 90% of the broadband market is dominated by the largest cable, telecom, and fixed wireless providers, AT&T, Comcast, Charter. And as a result of the high fixed costs and the lack of competition, many low profit areas are served by only one or two providers and are saddled with obsolete technologies because the thing is that not all broadband technologies are equal. The newest, the fastest technologies are often also the most expensive. And so they are not always financially viable everywhere. Wealthier areas are more likely to see new investment for the faster and more expensive technologies like fiber optic. There are also other geographic barriers as well. Broadband networks do not operate in a vacuum. The last mile, which serves homes and businesses, must connect with other networks, with other infrastructure that operates at a broader scale and enables data transmission with the backhaul. So the more isolated the population, the more difficult and expensive it is to reach and connect with the other infrastructure. This is why some technologies, fixed technologies like fiber optic, are not always financially viable, and fixed wireless and satellites have become more popular. If we could go back to the previous slide, please. Thank you. Finally, we also have policy-related barriers to draw private investment into unserved areas. Federal and state agencies run grant programs that help offset the costs for new build-out. And each of these programs have their own criteria, including definitions of broadband. And these definitions are not always consistent across agencies, so which is why there's a lot of different information when it comes to which speeds qualified as actual broadband. They evolve as broadband technologies do. And so there's a lack of coordination in terms of who is served and who is not, which has in turn impacted the federal broadband availability maps too. Much of the public data on this topic was collected and submitted by providers themselves, who have a stake in claiming some populations are unserved in order to discourage competition. Private providers have also lobbied against public competition, which is gaining traction among communities where private providers are not able or willing to serve. However, if a population is designated as served, they do not qualify for funding. So as you can see, all of these issues are interconnected. Next slide, please. So we have established the drivers of the divide. What are we proposing? What is the focus of our book? Now, first, Closing the Divide is a collective multi-level effort, which involves multiple actors and institutions that operate across all levels of government, federal, state, local. As I mentioned, private investment alone cannot close the divide. Despite billions in investment in broadband infrastructure, the divide persists. This was very evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. So government plays an important role in broadband expansion via funding and regulation. Government helps offset the cost of deployment via infrastructure grants, not only for the last mile networks that serve homes and businesses, but also to create more robust infrastructure that serves schools, libraries, hospitals, etc. Regulation ensures there is high standards of service for new infrastructure, best choice of technology possible, better download and upload speeds. And finally, regulatory institutions can help expand the range of broadband providers allowed to operate in their jurisdictions. Regional and small providers have emerged as viable partners for rural communities where national providers are unable or unwilling to serve. And this includes cooperatives, utilities, and even municipal providers. We will talk about this later in the presentation. And now I turn it over to Mildred.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Thank you for giving us that background of how the sector of broadband is structured. And it's kind of interesting that you point out that unlike other utilities, competition actually is possible and actually can be encouraged in the broadband sector. It's not a natural monopoly that works best with just one provider. So that's intriguing. I'd like to turn our attention now to the issue of federal and state policy. And Johannes Bohr, you are one who has a lot of expertise on policy. What are the values that guide it? And what's a sense of the history, where we've come from and where we might be heading with respect to federal policy?
Yes, thank you for the invitation to participate. And in 5 minutes, I can only give you a very brief snapshot of the developments. The roots of the idea of universal service, that everybody should be connected, every business, every individual should be connected to communications technology, is actually very old. It goes back way before electronic technology. In fact, James Madison, for example, in 1792 proposed that rates for newspapers should be subsidized, so to provide better access to rural locations. Became part of the Post Office Act. But then later, if I fast forward to electronic communications, if you show slide 5, please, for a moment. The principles of universal service were actually embedded in the foundational law that still guides communication services in the United States, the Communications Act of 1934, a New Deal era law that built on practical experiences that the states already had in preceding decades, the federal government had as telecommunications gradually became regulated. And I don't want to read it to you, but it essentially established that independently or without discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex, a rapid, efficient, nationwide and worldwide radio and communication service should be available at adequate facilities at reasonable charges. That's really all what we want to today, right? This, of course, initially applied to the telephone industry, and the term digital divide was not invented coined until the mid-1990s. The Department of Commerce actually noticed that there was a divide in internet access. But at that time, the technology had already started to change very, very quickly. And I'll give you a couple of additional pieces of information in a moment. But in response to those changes, the federal government started to struggle to how to address those issues. And policy went through like a transition phase. But in 2021, if you go to the next, it's the same slide, sorry. In 2021, in the Digital Equity Act of 2021, which became part of the infrastructure bill that was passed in a bipartisan way by the Biden administration, the term digital equity was introduced. And it's an enhancement, if you wish, of the historical notion of universal service, but it's defined as a condition in which individuals and communities have the information technology capacity that is needed for full participation in society of the United States and in the economy. Right? It reflects the fact that information technology has become indispensable for everything we do. Now, if you didn't have access to telephone services, perhaps there were pay phones, there were other options that you could use it. The disadvantages of not being connected were probably less important than they're nowadays. Nowadays, you don't have access, as you have said, to healthcare, to education, to jobs, and so forth. And so the problem, therefore, of this unequal access to technology is not new. It's actually permeates the history of communications technology. It's just a question of how policy has responded with the technological and economic challenge. And if you look at the broad sweep of history at the federal level again, we see actually three phases. One is the old, what I would like to call the old universal service model. If you briefly show slide 6, and you don't, just keep it up for like 30 seconds. It's very text heavy. And that model was essentially a model where voice services were regulated at the state level, at the federal level, and universal service was embedded in that model. The carriers were treated as common carriers according to the Communications Act of 1934, had an obligation to serve any reasonable demand for those services. Now, those challenges that Natasja mentioned, high cost, for example, and low income, they were overcome essentially internally. Carriers like AT&T or others, the Bell system, but predominantly, but there were 1,600 others. They made more money in urban areas that charged higher prices. They made more money for long distance companies, for long distance services, and then used the surplus to subsidize the extension of the network to rural and low income areas. And that model worked until technology changed and policy changed when dissatisfaction with that monopoly model actually grew, because there were many signs of inefficiencies, slow rate of innovation, high prices for some services. So gradually policymakers started to believe that competition might be a better solution. And we have a transition between 1984, when the Bell system was broken up, until 1996, when gradually, like a peeling of an onion, more and more competition was introduced. During that time, that liminal period, that transition period, a very complex system of access charges and interconnection fees arose that substituted for the internal model of cross subsidies that was the old universal service model. And so when the Telecommunications Act was envisioned and then finally passed in 1996, which was the first major reform of the 1934 Act, policymakers, business people, advocates realized that they needed to build a new universal service model. Like in that competitive environment that was envisioned, the old system didn't work, the transitional system didn't work, and so the Federal Communications Commission was empowered to establish the Universal Service Fund, and did it by establishing a separate agency called the Universal Service Administrative Corporation that then now administers 3 programs, one for high-cost locations, one for low-income consumers, one for E-rate, which is the service that connects community anchor institutions, schools, libraries, and one for rural hospitals. And that the Telecommunications Act actually had all the right pieces in place. It established that universal service was a moving target, that it would have to be redefined as technology evolved over time. It put a process in place to gradually update and periodically update the definition of universal service. And where this whole system collapsed, in my view, is that the implementation was wrong. failed eventually, right? It took the Federal Communications Commission and the State Federal Joint Board until the 2010s to even subsidize broadband. Until then, they thought that competition market forces would be strong enough to carry broadband to everybody. And you can't completely blame them. I think there was a strong trust that dynamic entrepreneurs would take their network, would upgrade it, would expand it, and so forth. And perhaps one couldn't have seen it completely, that it would not reach those rural areas. But there were voices, there were warning voices that said it will not work, right? So we knew more or less from the beginning that we needed a different program. And we have struggled since with finding that approach. I don't have enough time to go into the details, but what happened is that more and more federal agencies, for example, started to address the problem. So we had a proliferation of programs. We now have 25 programs that focus on broadband with many overlaps, and we have about 100 more programs that have some broadband component. And so we have this fragmentation of ideas, and the proliferation of programs at the state, at the federal level. And it's almost like we don't put enough force into just one simple program. And so the BEAD program, or the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, which was established in 2021, then was a massive effort. $42.5 billion were earmarked to fix those problems. By the time of 2021, not only did the pandemic, as you said, create a dramatic experience of what it means not to be connected, but because of all these other programs and these other initiatives, solving the remaining unserved location, addressing the problem to reach them was actually a very complicated problem. It was not straightforward. They were not all clustered in one place, dispersed over very complicated territories. So it took an extremely long planning effort. And we're literally now just on the cusp of implementing that program. And hopefully, I'm very encouraged to see that these things are happening. And that's in a nutshell. And there could be many more stories in the background how we got here from starting with the Postal Act of 1792.
Thank you very much, Johannes. You can see, our listeners, that we have on our panel someone who's very expert on all the intricacies of federal policy and its evolution. But you talk about this issue of fragmentation and the need to bring it all together, but we're a federal system here in the US, and state policy has a lot to say about broadband as well. And Colby, coming to us from the Pew Charitable Trust, Pew has set up a broadband initiative. Could you tell us a little bit about that and your work on state policy?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you again for having me. I'm Colby Humphrey, research officer at the Pew Charitable Trust, and I work on our broadband access initiative. And this initiative really works with state and federal lawmakers, researchers, other partners to try to accelerate this progress as a nation towards universal, affordable, high-speed internet service. And so we work collaboratively with stakeholders at the federal and state level, as just researching policy, looking at what's working and what's not across the states. And just so what we've been seeing the last few years is really we've looked at what states are doing in the realm of policy on broadband, and we've seen what you expect to see looking at the states. We've seen lots of different variations of how they're tackling lots of these problems. So some have a higher focus on technology preference or provider preferences, looking at variations in state and local capacity for the broadband offices themselves, of crafting policy, interacting with federal partners, those types of things. And when we come to the BEAD program, we've seen a additional variation of how states have gone about creating their plans, their final proposals. States are trying to balance this kind of newfound authority they have in some ways, right? They've been giving some flexibility in terms of choosing projects, designing their programs, trying to merge that with some of the guardrails in place to ensure public dollars are used to support long-term outcomes. They've also been confronting some uncertainty with the program itself, right? Some changes in federal guidance, things that are outside of the policy world as well, right? Like changing market shifts, dynamics, construction costs, workforce development issues, right? And so there are, because of that, right, we've seen different policy approaches across the states with BEAD. And what we've also started to see as well is variations in just the state policies that are being developed that could go beyond BEAD, right? And so if you could pull up slide 8 for a moment, we are really looking at four key policy areas for us in terms of how states can address broadband moving forward. And what this map is showing is just adding these four policies together, right? And where states are at across these four domains. And I want to emphasize red does not mean bad. We are not in no way ranking states. We're just tracking where they're at and these policies being established in statute at the state level. And so one of those for us is wanting to see some form of state infrastructure funding, right? Like we know that BEAD, other federal programs, these do not go on forever, right? They are time limited. And so if states can have their own funds set up, right, to really establish some funding mechanisms to continue broadband expansion, right, to kind of complement the existing funds they have, right, like looking at ways to expand networks, to maintain networks over time, right? These types of funds give them flexibility to do that. And so we again see variation in what that looks like across the states. Similarly, looking at affordability, right? And so this is another area we've already touched on that affordability policies have somewhat been in flux. And so we are looking at what are some options for states in the world of affordability, right? Whether that's we're not recommending any policies, but looking at things such as low-cost plans, reforming state universal service or lifeline, or even direct subsidies from the states as well, and really pegging that to these state broadband programs, right? So if you are participating in the state broadband program, we think it would be a beneficial idea, right, as a state to have a firm policy requiring some sort of participation in a affordability program as a contingent part of that award. And then looking at the third one, minimum speed floors, which kind of go with the network scalability piece, right? We know that speeds have what consumers are using from a broadband speed standpoint continues to go up, right? And so we are looking to see what states actually have a minimum speed floor in statute, right? For building out new networks with grant program dollars. Some just defer to the current FCC standard. Some exceed the current FCC standard of 100 over 20, but wanting to see that in statute, right, to ensure that when a network is built, people have access to a high-speed network that allows them to take advantage of educational opportunities, workforce opportunities, telehealth, these types of things. And then last, looking at having some requirements for speed scalability, right? Being able to make sure that networks that are built can scale to higher speeds over time. Because this is, again, another thing that we have noticed in the research. Just the demands on these networks continue to go up. They will continue to go up moving forward, right? And so if you can have some requirement at a state level from a state policy standpoint that the networks being built can scale to these higher speeds over time, that certainly would be beneficial from our standpoint. And so that's kind of a quick snapshot of the state policies that we have been looking at. We certainly are again seeing lots of variation in how states are attacking these issues. But we continue to monitor them going forward and look forward to seeing how progress is made across the states.
Thank you very much, Colby. It's really important to think about the differences across these 50 states and their policy environment and how that articulates with the federal level policy. But there's also the challenge of how that articulates with local level innovation. And now we move to the third part of our webinar today. And I do encourage you to please put your questions in the chat. We've had this first segment on what is the digital divide and what causes it. We've had this second segment on state and federal policy. If you have any questions about those, please put them in the chat and we'll bring them up into the discussion. But as we move to our third area, which is looking at local action and innovation, I'm going to bring Natasha Bravo back to talk about some of the work that we've seen in California, Colorado, and Maine. And then we'll follow with Dan Lamb, who talks about a municipal effort here in New York. But Natasha, could you tell us about local innovation?
Thank you, Mildred. So our book includes several case studies regarding local action and innovation from different states, as you mentioned. We identify some of the factors that were key in successful community-led broadband projects. Now, overall, an important strategy is identifying and leveraging both economic and non-economic community resources. So broadband infrastructure is not really just about the funding and the financing, even though, yes, those are foundational. But many of these projects, for example, had active agents involved, meaning broadband advocates, local government leaders, community leaders. These agents are key in gathering support for new projects. If you'd like to convince your community that this is a worthy object, of tax financing and funding, you need these leaders. They bring potential partners to the table. They identify local or regional providers, people you can work with, and coordinate with state and federal agencies to gain access for new funding. So it's important to have a voice. The COVID-19 pandemic was an important window of opportunity for many of these communities. The pandemic shed light on connectivity disparities and needs, and the federal government and states established new sources of funding for new infrastructure. We then have public-private partnerships. So many rural communities partner with their local regional broadband provider, cooperative, or utility to address urgent connectivity needs. The difference, in contrast of working with just a national provider, is that many of the people that work in these firms are people who live nearby. They are your neighbors, or they are in the neighboring towns. And so they have a higher stake in making this project successful because they experience firsthand what these disparities in connectivity can cause. And finally, these projects are not just about financial viability. Yes, that is a basic component, but many must also guarantee an additional positive impact for the community. So for example, by focusing on groups that are most affected by the divide. So one of the case studies that we profile is the school district in Santa Cruz, California. You can see the photo, the children that were benefited from this project. And so the school district in Santa Cruz, California partnered with a mission-driven provider to bring wireless connectivity to school parking lots and low-income homes during the pandemic. If you go next slide, please. Thank you. So Colorado is another state that we profile in the book. Each state has their own unique set of challenges and goals. For Colorado, very great challenges rooted on the difficult topography and remoteness of many of the unserved and underserved populations. So many of the little networks, the last mile networks that serve homes and businesses, sometimes rely on a single fiber optic cable to gain access to the broader internet, so the middle mile. So when it gets damaged, the entire community loses service. So what Colorado does, it supports public-private partnerships between local governments and different types of providers, private, public, cooperatives, to create more robust networks. One of the case studies that we profile in the book is Rio Blanco County. The county partnered with a local electric utility to build a new publicly owned open access fiber optic network, which does several things. First, it connects to the nearest middle mile, making the network more robust. So if one cable gets damaged, the service can continue. It connects the county's two largest towns via fiber, and it also supports fixed wireless connectivity in more rural areas. Why? Because fiber optic is foundational in order to support connectivity from the towers that then provide wireless connectivity. So working with your local electric utility facilitates access to utility poles and electric easements, and there's an efficiency advantage in working with your regional providers. If we can go to the next slide, please. And then another state that we profile in the book is Maine. Maine is small, deeply rural, and with fewer resources than other states. So the state strategy is to work with coalitions, not just individual communities, as it's more effective to coordinate partnerships and solutions at the regional level. We see this kind of strategy when they are coordinated, say, public transportation solutions, for example. It's just easier to work at the regional level. So coalitions allow communities to pool demand for resources together to attract new investment. And Maine funds both public and private providers. So one private network case study is the Peninsula Utility for Broadband to gain access to federal funding for new fiber optic network. A 6-town coalition in the Blue Hill Peninsula partnered with the state's broadband office and with a national broadband provider to gain faster, more affordable service. They were not in the position to build or operate their own network. So working with established provider worked better. Now, on the other end, you have the Down East Broadband Utility District. And these communities were interested in public ownerships because it allowed them to retain control over the quality of service, the cost, and the universal availability. So two towns in Washington County formed a broadband utility district to share the cost of financing a new fiber optic network, and then the state later helped expand its networks. So local state collaboration is key, whether these projects decide to go public or private. And now I turn it over to Mildred.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And we actually have a question that came in from Alina about how state and federal policy and local collaborate to implement projects. And I think we just saw a bit of an example of that in what you described. I'd like to turn now, though, to Dan Lamb to talk about a unique and important approach, which is municipal broadband. Can you tell us about the project in Dryden, Dan?
Sure. Thank you, Mildred. And hello, everyone. For me, the digital divide is it's personal, it's tangible, and it's political. I'm a local politician in addition to teaching at the Cornell Brooks School, and I teach public policy here. But I know that I don't have high-speed internet connections in my own house, and neither do my constituents. So I see this as an important policy to work on for a number of reasons to better serve our community. We have municipal broadband in the town of Dryden, and it's extending into our neighboring town, the town of Caroline, this year. We began having paying customers in 2022, providing faster, more affordable internet. Our price is much more affordable than the competition. I'll show you a slide on that in a moment. I believe we are the first fully municipal owned and operated service in New York State. There are municipalities that own the dark fiber or own the fiber itself, but allow commercial enterprises to carry on their lines. But ours is a complete municipal service. We do the billing, we do the customer service, we do the installations through a system of subcontractors. But it's all run through the town of Dryden for now. And we started this to really address issues concerning price, availability, speed, and customer satisfaction. People around here do not like their carrier. So when we talk about, community resources, as Natasha did just a moment ago, part of it was our community didn't support what was offered previously to when we started our service. And today we have about 600 paying customers, and we have about 400 or 500 customers on the waiting list, including me. I can't wait till my service is started. But going along the lines with what Natasha was just explaining in terms of community resources, we also have active agents, and I would put myself in that category as somebody who saw the potential here about 10 years ago. And we commissioned a study to look at the market feasibility of this work. And that took $25,000 of town funds, which we had to justify to our constituents. And I'll tell you, some didn't like the idea of us getting into this space. But we commissioned a study to look at how this might serve our community better. And then we had some opportunities once we got the project underway, as was mentioned earlier, some of the funding that became available at the federal level. And also the pandemic reminded people how important broadband access was. So we were sort of swimming in the right direction when these other influences came along, like funding, like public interest in better broadband service. And then we had a lot of support from community institutions, including Cornell University. I've been able to oversee a number of studies that have helped further this project in terms of its management structure, its finances, and its marketing. And additionally, in terms of positive impact, having our early adopters rave about it and get the word out into community that the service is cheaper, faster, and more reliable has helped us tremendously. So these are things that have helped us get off the ground. But to just give you a little more perspective, we're serving a combined area of about 16,000 residents. Most of them are in the town of Dryden, where I serve, but we have a neighboring community of 1,500 that we also serve. We've had considerable investment from the federal government in our project. But we wouldn't have gotten that if we hadn't had something to offer in the first place to apply for. So we got initial funding from the Appalachian Regional Commission, about 600,000 from that. We got 2 million from the ARA, the Reinvestment Act of 2021, that was allocated to municipalities, and that helped us do some initial work. But the big funding source that we got was through the Municipal Infrastructure Program of ARA, which came out for us in 2024, where we secured up to about $12 million through that program. But we were going to do this with or without outside funding. We had projected that if we just use municipal bonding and a long-term repayment plan, this project could work. So we've invested about $6 million in municipal bonds into this project as well. We consider this a $40 million project. I'm sorry, a 40-year project. But I will say the estimated costs are much higher than we initially thought. And if we had known what we were getting into from the get-go, we might not have done it. But we still think we're on the right track. If this winds up costing $25 or $30 million, the repayment will still be there, because we can repay the loans that we've taken out, the bonding, in about 12 years. And the economic impact is what I think really needs to be looked at in terms of how much money we're saving our residents and how that's reinvested into our community. We think when this is fully deployed, we'll be seeing about 1.7 million put back into our community if we just have 7,000 paying customers. If we're saving those 7,000 customers $21 a month, and you do the math on that over a year, you wind up having a significant new amount of funding staying in your community, not going out to a ISP from outside of the area. I'll just close with some things that I wish I knew when we started out. The importance of professionalism early on. We depended too much on a volunteer board to run this, and the goodwill of some contractors. We might have been a little too naive on that goodwill part. I think we could have got off to a faster start if we had professionalized earlier. I was able to bring in an executive director, which we hired full-time in 2024, with immense experience, and he has really gotten this project back on track, where we expect to hit our marks and really be fully deployed by 2027. So these are important things that we've been able to work on. But I'm going to wrap up there and save time later. I do just want to mention that one of our goals is to get this out of town government and moving it into an LLC format, so it's run by a group that's off the town budget and is managing it from the outside.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. You can see what a big lift a municipal broadband effort can be. And I think that's why
my automatic light just went out.
Which is why when Natasha was talking about the two cases in Maine, one went public, one stayed private, because if you have a mission-driven private partner, they might have the scale to reach what you need. I want to bring the whole panel into discussion. If going on Alina's question, how do federal and states collaborate for policy design and implementation? We've seen a little bit of discussion of collaboration. I think Colby, you might have some ideas on this. Johannes, you might. Dan has a positive story of the role that the state has played. Could I open up the state-federal collaboration discussion for a minute? Maybe turning to you first, Colby.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly It's definitely needed, right? These in terms of how these state programs are being run, like there is this need to have a healthy relationship with your local governments, with providers across the state, with federal officials as well. So just being able to maintain those relationships really is key for these programs to work and work effectively.
And Johannes, what do you see as the evolving federal-state relationship as we're moving forward?
Yeah, so I can just weigh in briefly. The BEAD program, right, that latest effort to close the remaining digital divide, was actually conceptualized as a program that was under federal coordination, but implemented by the states, recognizing that many of the remaining issues are local issues. And then within the states, the vision was that communities would be involved too, right? And it was a process that included lots of those local stakeholders too, because every one of those or many of those remaining locations looks very different topology, different climate conditions, you name it, different distance. And the federal government does not have the information to fix this. And the relationship, though, I think has turned somewhat sour, right? I mean, ideally, you'd have like a nested system where the federal government does what it does best, define the overall vision, then you have the local implementation. And because of the complexity of the problem and the desire to proceed with due diligence, I think the BEAD program has become more complex than it was intended to be, even under the previous administration. And now under the new administration, the Trump administration, first of all, changed it from a more visionary, overarching program that included both the investment into the network infrastructure as well as the complementary skills and workforce training that is needed to really make most use of those networks. It was slimmed down back to an infrastructure program again, right? A very narrow vision. And I think many of the benefits that could actually come from that investment will be lower because of that narrowing of the vision, right? And that the interaction between the state and the federal level was complicated, I think, at the least. From what I hear from the states, there are many points of friction and many points of disagreement, but eventually everybody wants to move forward. So as I said before, I'm really happy to see that this is now happening.
Natasha, do you want to talk about an example of how different some of the state policies are?
Yes, of course. So in our study of about 17 states, so each state runs their own broadband office. Each of them have their own unique challenges, goals. And so, for example, they have different broadband definitions. And depending on the definition, they prioritize specific areas. They can be low-income areas, low-density areas, areas under economic distress. They target these areas for funding. In addition, they also, not all states allow allow different types of providers to apply for funding. Some states are fund a broader range of public-private providers, traditional and non-traditional. Other states prefer to continue working with private providers. Do we also see some differences in terms of the types of technologies that are eligible? A few years ago, satellite or previous generations of satellites were not eligible for state funding, but as the technology evolved, we see now that satellite is taking the lion's share, not just of federal funding, but perhaps in the future of state funding. They also recognize that sometimes, again, the best technologies are not feasible everywhere. So we have different policies in terms of broad definitions, technologies, speeds, etc.
Keeping our focus on the state, I'd like to turn attention to Dan. And how did you and your Dryden Fiber initiative, how important was collaboration with the state for you?
Well, it was very important. And, there are a number of states with restrictive regulations that either prohibit or greatly restrict municipal broadband. And here in New York, just to get our bonding going, and our bond council advised us that we weren't able to raise municipal bond funds because the state did not, in our laws, affirm the right for municipal broadbands to operate. And it seems quirky, it didn't prohibit it, but it didn't affirm it. So I had a discussion with our state comptroller. Fortunately, I know our state comptroller, and I was able to talk to him about this. And he said, well, Dan, what you need to do is get a bill passed in Albany, passed in the state Senate and the state Assembly, affirming the right for a municipality to own and operate broadband. And if you know anything about New York government, that seemed like a big ask at the time to get special legislation for the town of Dryden. But we tried. And fortunately, I have a good working relationship with our assembly member. And she did the work along with the state senator. And maybe this slid under the radar of the big telecom companies, and it got passed before they realized they should stop it. But we got it through, and now municipal broadband has a legislative authority, statutory authority, I should say, to operate. But that's not the only thing we needed. We also currently have legislation introduced in Albany to allow the payback period of municipal bonding for broadband to go beyond 10 years. Right now, it's limited at 10 years. And you can imagine on a 40-year project, it's hard to pay back several million, if not 10 million, in a period of 10 years. So we have other needs that need to get through the state legislature. And for anyone interested in this topic, just know that you have to have a network or at least some connections or dare I say a lobbyist to help you resolve some of these things at the state level.
Thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate your grounded experience from the local initiative in Dryden. I want to Natasha, you alluded to the issue of satellite, and we had a question from Ella earlier in the program where she asked, do you think the move towards fiber and building out forms of infrastructure with longevity was a good move, given the change in the political atmosphere? Because fiber or those kinds of forms of infrastructure can't be rolled back as easily or canceled. Johannes, I'm going to turn that question to you first, and then anyone else who wants to pipe in. I know Dryden Fiber is using fiber, but Johannes, do you want to take that one on?
Yeah, of course. That's a very interesting question, and so there's pros and cons. I think that one has to clearly see. For one, fiber currently is the technology that is most scalable. We know, and it's scalable at low cost. Once you have incurred that high investment cost up front, right? Scaling it to higher capacity can be done by replacing electronics at the end of those fibers and maybe repeaters in between, which is a much lower expense than rebuilding a whole network. And it most likely will serve us for decades. That's the same is not true for the other technologies, satellites or fixed wireless. It's not impossible. Those technologies might advance at a rate that might enable them to scale at a rate that follows demand. But we don't have the proof yet that this is possible. So there's a higher level of uncertainty there. On the other hand, the con argument in my view is this. Computing technology also may change, right? I mean, we talk a lot about quantum computing, for example, and it's not completely clear that the existing fiber networks will work as well with quantum computing. Most likely they will, and most likely we'll find solutions to make it happen, right? But there's also risk factors why fiber might eventually have to be replaced with some other technology. But we have bought a really long planning horizon by going to fiber. The initial BEAD program actually had a strong fiber preference, which was eliminated in the restructured BEAD program. And there's good and bad reasons for it, in my view. As I said, I mean, I think the most important thing for the American public, and especially those who are not served, is that there's eventually a movement to closing those remaining locations after such a long planning period. But I think to come back to the question, right, the fiber infrastructure will be resilient against sort of day-to-day policy cycles. That's probably a good and keen observation.
Thank you very much for that. Another question that we've been asked by Ibrahim was this idea of all the fragmented federal policies. Would the ideal solution be a streamlined funding pipeline or better coordination across agencies? And if so, what would that coordination look like? Or might I add to that question, in a moment of policy uncertainty, maybe having 50 states with different approaches might also have some advantages. So I'm going to throw that question back toward Johannes and also toward Colby.
Okay, I'll answer, but give me a timeout signal, because as a
I will.
typical academic, I can't stay short. First of all, I think it's important to remember that the states have historically served as a laboratory for American politics, right? Repeatedly, there's cycles when the states were really active. States moved in different directions, tried different policy experiments, and gradually there was mutual learning. They would observe each other, and gradually we would pick the best models that worked, and often the federal government would eventually consolidate if an issue was in the federal jurisdiction. And I could imagine similar things happening here. Although, future networks are highly localized, and the technology also is highly localized. So I think going forward, I think there's a lot of room for locations and for communities in states to be very innovative and experimental. And maybe the pressure to consolidate at the federal level is not so high. And interagency coordination is a problem, I think, that occurs everywhere. And it's not just communications technology, but there it's visible too, that many problems require effective coordination across divisions and departments that historically don't really talk well to each other. So for example, using digital technology for education purposes is not just a question of bringing the networks to households. It's also a question of how do we educate? How do we run our classrooms? How do parents educate and constrain technology use by their children? And so you would need actually ideally task forces that cut across areas. And in some states, I think that works better than in others. If you look forward to AI, we mentioned it a couple of times, right? The similar issues arises at an even more urgent level, in my view. And at the federal level, when I was there, that interagency coordination did not work very well, unfortunately. It was very complicated. It was often impeded by the character of the individuals running an agency who might not be able to talk to each other. And I think it's one of those urgent reforms that we need, interagency, interdepartmental collaboration. Probably we need a visioning task force too, that sort of does horizon scanning as to where technology is going, right? To make sure that we need more agility in that sense. So in agility and interdepartmental collaboration would be really usable. And some states actually have moved in those directions, and I'm really encouraged to see that.
Great. Colby, do you want to add anything? We're just about ready to wrap up.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think I could add too much to the federal side of what Johannes already mentioned, other than to point out that the Government Accountability Office has a number of reports specifically on this topic, if that is of interest to anyone. And I would also echo just the role of states here, right? We've looked at, again, lots of the variation that we see already in state broadband policy. So we would certainly say there is an opportunity to learn from the states right now, like how they are implementing these different programs, their funding opportunities, how they're setting their speed and network scalability thresholds, and that as a researcher, that's very exciting because it gives me a chance to look at that variation and a chance to learn from what the states are doing. And I'd also agree with Johannes. Traditionally, that's an opportunity to where we can take those lessons learned at the state and potentially shift it to the federal level if that's appropriate. But right now, I think empowering states across several of these policy domains would be a good start.
Thank you very much. I just want to end with what do you see as the emerging issues? Just a quick phrase from each of you that we should be thinking about, the public should be thinking about as we address this challenge of the digital divide. And I'm going to start with Natasja.
So one of the main challenges, I believe, since our focus has been on access to infrastructure, remain adoption and affordability. So again, losing all of that funding that would help overcome adoption barriers will have repercussions in the future. So it's definitely one of the things I see.
Adoption, great. Dan, what do you see as an emerging issue?
Well, I think my town has a certain burden right now. We need to prove that municipal owned and operated broadband works, that it's an efficient and effective, equitable model. That's what the investments made in our project expect. That's what our constituents expect. So we feel a certain amount of pressure to deliver and to deliver soon. And we want to, and we want to be a model. We get contacted by municipalities and entities from all over the country trying to figure out what we're doing and how it's working out. So it's a goal that we don't take lightly because we feel like we have a certain burden on us to show that this thing can work.
Great. Johannes, an emerging issue?
Yeah, so the emerging issue for me goes way back to the past. I think we need to rejuvenate that Madisonian vision of what it means to have access to information and be connected to our fellow human beings and businesses and so forth, and embrace it looking forward. And that means that we need to sort of rethink what we mean by universal service in the future, because it will change even faster than what is envisioned in the Telecommunications Act. It will continuously change, technology will evolve, the skills needed will evolve, and we need to have better systems in place and procedures in place to redefine what we mean by universal service and then implement it in areas where we think policy is needed. I'm a strong believer in market forces, and I think they have served many very well. But we also know that market forces don't serve low-income people, they don't serve rural areas, and it's not rocket science to fix this. And I think we need to remember that we actually know the solutions to those problems. We just have to find the willingness to do it well and in a very prudent way and we can do this.
Thank you. Colby?
Yeah, I would go back to network scalability and just the driving demand on these networks, and because we have to bring up AI in every discussion now, but in all seriousness, just the role of AI applications, putting new demands on networks. We already see evidence that consumers with higher speeds are using AI tools at a higher rate than those at lower speeds, and or the potential for that to become a problem over time. And so I would go back to the need for networks to be able to scale to these higher demands over time.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. And I want to thank our listeners for being part of the discussion today. You'll be able to find this this webinar on the same link that you signed up. And I'd like to remind you once again, the book that we have is available for free if you want to show that slide. And remember that our future issues, adoption, municipal broadband, universal service, and new definitions for that, and the issue of scalability. Thank you all to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to eCornell, and have a good afternoon.